Okay, so this is a completely unrehearsed, as you will see, discussion. Looking back, a reminiscence, but also with some lessons for today. As I said, for those of you who are at the membership committee, the membership meeting, I want to just reiterate, we're going to end with an informal, non-binding, non-reported poll, in which I will ask all of you in the room 2 questions. Question 1, do we need another Greenspan-like commission? That's question number 1. And question number 2, for those of you who said yes, sooner or later? And I'll say sooner meaning within the next 5 years, and later meaning somewhere past 5 years. That sound fair? And I'll ask each of the panelists at some point to give their perspective. But to get us started, just tell us what you were doing in 1982 and 83 that got you to the commission, and what your role was as staff to the commission. And since you came late, you go first.
Okay. I'm Eric Kingson. I was the junior member of what we thought of as the Democratic staff. Mert Bernstein and myself and Betty Duskin. I got to it through a friend, Steve McConnell, some of you know. I had written a dissertation with Department of Labor money, and it was about to be published, and then Mr. Reagan became president, and it was stopped. It was all in print. Horrible thing for a new professor. I brought it over to the House Committee on Aging. It got published, and somehow they decided they wanted a friend like me on the commission. It was all happenstance and extraordinary.
So I was, I think I was young, anyway, young by comparison, staffer for John Heinz. I just joined the committee literally the day before Reagan announced his plan for Social Security, his comprehensive plan for Social Security. So I had just come to Washington from graduate school, so I didn't really know anything about Washington, and I was told to go to Secretary Schweiker's office at 9 o'clock in the morning the next morning, which I wasn't quite sure where that was or what I was supposed to be doing there. But it turned out that the president was announcing, or Schweiker was announcing the president's Social Security plan, which died on impact. And then so as things fell apart later on in the year and the president was putting the commission together, we were pushing for Senator Heinz, who was the chairman of the Aging Committee, as a counterpoint to Senator Pepper in the House, who was a chairman of the House Aging Committee, to kind of have a balance there. And so Dole put Heinz on, and I was Heinz's advisor on Social Security. And I slept in a Holiday Inn Express the night before, so I was in good shape.
And in some ways, I was destined to do retirement income work because I started working in a law firm doing tax work when ERISA in 1974, when ERISA was enacted. And then I went and started working for Senator Jack Danforth from Missouri, who was on Finance Committee in 1977 when the 1977 amendments were enacted. The 1981 was really when the 83 amendments started. There was movement in Congress, and there's a story that I hope we'll go into about the origins of the commission. But, you know, I was basically reading it all in the paper that it had all fallen apart, that Tip O'Neill had said, you know, third rail and all of that, and everything had ground to a halt. And the President Reagan said he was going to set up this commission, and he was picking Alan Greenspan as his chairman, and my phone rang at my desk. This is Alan Greenspan. I'd like to interview you to be my assistant. And what happened was he had called Howard Baker's office, and they had known, and they recommended me. So I wound up going to work as his assistant.
No, I'm supposed to hijack this and send it to.
Oh, because you've got it. Oh, okay. All right. Can you hear? Okay. I'm Suzanne Blouin. I had been at the House Ways and Means Committee, and when the chairman retired, I left there to go to the National Commission on Social Security, just the NCSS. Steve was there with me. And we worked on that commission for a year or two, and then I met Bob Myers through that commission and went back to Social Security and worked with him as he was deputy commissioner. So I was, with him, and when he was asked to be executive director of the Greenspan Commission, he brought me along with him. And it was a year to be remembered.
Hi, I'm Steve Goss. I was an Austin actuary back at that time, had been there for a little while, worked for a guy named Frank Bile. Many of you knew who he was, who at that time worked for Harry Ballantyne. And we were lucky enough to be involved with these commissions, as Suzanne mentioned, sort of the predecessor to the NCSSR, sometimes called Greenspan Commission or Ball Commission or Myers Commission. Much was done there, like, for instance, developing what we now know as the DRC and the level of the DRC. So a lot of advanced work was done there. But we really enjoyed working with everybody in this group and many others on the commission. We weren't actually part of the direct staff from the Office of the Actuary, but provided a few numbers. If you want to have any sort of like look at some of the things that are in the cookbook for the future and were in the cookbook for consideration back then, look at Appendix K from the NCSSR Commission's report, because it has a whole bunch of stuff in there.
And Bruce Schobel, Bruce, if you would just indicate how you got involved, what were you doing at the time?
Well, at the time, I was working for Bob Myers as deputy commissioner. He was named as executive director, of course, and he asked me if I would go with him and be his assistant at the commission, along with, all the other people. The staff was really very small. It was, no more than a dozen people, I would say, including, some administrative folks. But anyway, I went over there with Bob, and the two of us, tried to respond to the requests from the commissioners themselves, and we acted as sort of an intermediary with the actuaries at SSA when we needed numbers to be crunched. We tried to help formulate the proposals and go to people like Steve Goss and get cost estimates for them, and it was all a pretty smooth process, really.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is ask each of you to just talk about what you consider to have been the toughest issue for the commission to come to a consensus on, based on what they ended up recommending. Where was there the most contentious discussion, without, of course, disclosing anything you feel uncomfortable disclosing? Just so you know, what was I doing at the time? I was a consultant to the Citizens Committee on Aging of New York, and all I got to do was observe all of the public meetings. So I saw everything that was divulged to the public, which turns out to have been not what really happened, right? That was the show. But it was still fascinating because you got to see real giants talking about the issues that were so important. So let me skip, we'll do a rotate. Start with Larry. Larry, what, in your view, was the most contentious issue for the commission?
Well, I actually kind of think that's the wrong question. No, because I don't think it was the commission that was the problem. So my view is that the commission was a 12-month exercise in giving a smokescreen and a little bit of time to try to bring the president around to the idea that they had backed up so close to the failure of the trust funds, quote unquote, because it's in the mind as, whether it was a failure or not, but they were so close to when the trust funds were essentially going to go broke that the only thing they could do was to raise taxes in the short term and transfer vast amounts of money from one part of the budget to the other. And so that was the answer in the short term, and the president was absolutely committed to not doing anything about raise taxes. And so it took a year before Dick Darman got up the courage to raise the point with the president that there really was no other option. And actually the commission was gone by that point, and they were in Blair House with a very small group when the real negotiations got down to brass tacks. And so, but I think that was where the real action was.
But I think I agree with that, although I'd put a little bit of a different nuance to it. As I said, the Congress was moving ahead in 1981 on legislation. The Pickle subcommittee was moving along, and they kept saying to the president, where's your proposal? David Stockman was head of OMB. He hated Social Security. He saw it as a way to really get a lot of budget cuts, proposed a very dramatic reduction in early retirement benefits for people who are just a couple years away from retiring. The whole country went berserk. That all stopped. And this was really, the reporting date, this was set up, that was all happening in 1981. The fall of 1981, they conveniently made the reporting date December of 1982. Now, what was happening to make the date December of 1982? Obviously, it was after the 1982 election. It was an effort to get through the election and as you say, try to have some cover. Although the Democrats ran very strongly on no cuts, and they're out to destroy your program, and you got to vote for us. And they won very big in the 1982 election, but they all saw that they had to come up with something. So right after the election, that's when the negotiation got serious. Now, I think it was, well, definitely before that, and I don't mean to, if other people want to jump in, but I had a very interesting experience. There was some substance that was done before then. The first question that Alan Greenspan was concerned about was trying to reach consensus. This was in the spring. This was, the commission started in January of 1982. And the first order of business was to agree on the size of the problem. And the commission was 15 members, 5 appointed by the White House, 5 by the House, 5 by the Senate, different parties. So technically there were 7 Democrats, but 2 of the Democrats were named by Ronald Reagan, and they were conservative Democrats. So the leaders were, the 5 progressives were the ones that Eric was talking about, and Bob Ball was the unofficial leader of that. And Alan always wanted me to go and negotiate for him so he could have deniability. What? She said, what? Of course we're not going for that. So he wanted, as you know, the actuaries come up with 3, they have an intermediate projection and an optimistic and a low cost and a high cost. And Alan thought that he wanted to be the high cost one, because then he felt you couldn't do it all on one side or the other and you'd have to have compromise. But he wanted me to talk to Bob Ball and see where he was. This was for the short term. For the long term, they were using the intermediate. But for the short term, the pessimistic assumptions, which Congress normally didn't do. I had worst case.
We went even beyond all 3.
And so I remember the International Club where Bob liked to have lunch, going to lunch with him, and just asking him what did he think the baseline should be, without saying what Alan was thinking. And Congress had just enacted the 1977 amendments. Oh, it's fine for 75 years, and then all of a sudden it showed these deficits again. And so Bob, for a completely different reason, wanted to use pessimistic assumptions because he wanted to make sure that we didn't have that again for confidence. And so that was sort of a note of consensus. And that really, the whole time, there was a lot of consensus. I wouldn't say there was a really tough issue.
Short-term consensus in terms of using the pessimistic assumptions in the short term, but the intermediate in the long term.
Oh, yeah.
They like that mic.
No, it's-
Am I?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I would just say that the thing that really struck me so was we would have Bob Myers, and many of you remember him, and he could talk Social Security for a very long time. And we would have these meetings, and we would have Bob out there by himself at a table just spouting Social Security for hours and hours. And in the background, we'd see all this chitter-chatter going on among the members. And frankly, just being around, the giants like Moynihan and Dole, and it was really, it was an amazing experience. But I do remember kind of chuckling about just having Bob sort of take the stage so that the other work could be done behind the scenes.
I would say, as I recall, the challenge at the time was that it was a confluence moment. It was a moment where we not only realized we had long-term shortfalls, but we also had serious short-term shortfalls. And in fact, we had reached the point in 1982 where, by the classic sense, we had actually depleted the reserves, and we started to have some special legislation to have borrowing across trust funds. For a while, as many of you recall, the OESI fund was the one having trouble, then had to borrow from the DI and then the HI trust fund. And it was eventually paid back, but only after enactment of these proposals. So we had the proverbial back against the wall, which oftentimes elicits and provokes action, which we did have. But as to the biggest challenge, I mean, there were so many challenges, it's hard to count. But one of the biggest challenge, I guess we'd have to say for the commission, was that 1/3 of the fix that the commission couldn't agree on, which was then left for a conclusion when it went back to the Hill, which is another thing which we may or may not want to get to. Some interesting stories about how that got concluded. Yeah.
Bruce, from your perspective, issues of serious contention?
Oh yeah, I've got one. This is a very esoteric, but it's also very interesting. Once everybody on the commission had agreed, or more or less agreed on a set of tax increases, they still weren't bringing in enough money to get through 1983. They really needed some sort of a cash infusion, and nobody wanted to just transfer general revenues. So we really started looking under rocks. I mean, we were just trying to figure out some way to bring in cash that would not, violate the principle of no general revenue financing, or only the most modest general revenue financing. And finally, a few of us got together and sort of came up with the idea of refinancing military service wage credits, which had been paid basically in arrears when the benefits were paid. When veterans came and applied for benefits, the Treasury would then pay the additional cost of their wage credits. And I guess I was one of the first people to say, well, hold on, General Motors can't do that. They have to pay the taxes at the time the wages are earned, and why shouldn't the military do the same thing? And if we did that, reaching all the way back to the beginning, that would raise a huge amount of money. It was about $26 billion. And that really filled the gap that we needed filled so that the trust funds did not go broke on July 1st, 1983, like they would have otherwise.
Just one comment. First, it's remarkable what everyone at this table was under age 18. It's remarkable at what at that time. But Bruce, I have one of my very fond memories. Tell me if it tracks with you. I remember being in the elevator in November when they began to talk about reaching agreement on the problem. And Bob Dole walked in. You were there, and Betty Duskin and several, I think Bert Seidman and myself, whatever. You walked in, and Senator Dole walks in, and he says, "Gentlemen, do any of you know how we can get some money into the trust funds quick?" And your response, Bruce, was, "I do, but Bob Myers doesn't want me to tell you."
Yes, that's
Honest
right.
to God. Do you remember that?
I remember that very vividly, yes, because Bob just didn't want to do that. And I said, but this is the answer, this is the Holy Grail. And so, of course, I let it slip. And it caught on. People liked it. I mean, Bob
he walked
Wall
out
loved
with
it.
you. He walked out with you and wanted to talk with you, as I
Yep.
recall. So
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know about the most difficult thing. There were many difficult things, but I think from the Democrats' point of view, it was gaining some consensus to accept a hit or two. And I remember the discussion in the little group of Democrats, which were the 5 Democrats Nancy mentioned, plus Bert Seidman, Lane Kirkland, well, he was on the commission, and some of the other staff. And Bob kind of walked in November and said, we have to accept a little cut to the COLA to show them we're serious. And that was Bob, the masterful negotiator. The other thing he said, 2 other things that Bob said was, I remember he went to SOS, Save Our Security, which was a activist organization headed by Wilbur Cohn and Arthur Fleming, and Bob was involved. I was at a meeting that he went to, and he said, the last couple of years were about blocking action. Now it's time to come to agreement and get the best deal. And I think he was sort of greeted a little bit with a little bit of skepticism, but that was Bob doing his statesperson-like work.
So we'll continue to rotate, and in parts as you can add comments, but I want to pose different questions for all of you. Also, all of you should have a copy of this book. This is the Bob Ball's version of what happened with really a fascinating historical perspective that I assume everybody on this panel has read. But let me just throw out another issue. Was there any point where fundamental restructuring of Social Security was on the table, or did the commission begin with a constraint that said work within the existing system as opposed to any fundamental change? So Nancy, let me start with you on that.
Yeah, there were actually two decisions that were made from the outset. One was to look at just the cash programs, not look at hospital insurance or Medicare. And the other was to exactly we were going to retain the structure of Social Security. And in fact, I meant to look at the report before I came. I'm pretty sure the very first recommendation was maintain the current structure, no private accounts, none of this. It was all swirling around the same way it is today, but the decision was made. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The members believe that the very first recommendation was that, and they all agreed to that.
Can I just add something? Can I
Sure.
put a footnote on that? I think the president appointed several people to the commission with the belief that they would drive the commission to a more fundamental reform. And so I think it was very interesting that it was taken off the table very early in the process.
I think they were mainly. I mean, he did put some people
Well,
on
Bill
who were quite.
Armstrong and
No, they were
Bill
quite.
Archer and-
They were quite conservative and had that view. But I think, Alan Greenspan saw he was really Reagan's representative, and in the final debate, it was Bob Ball really representing Tip O'Neill and Alan representing Reagan, and his attitude was that his job was to try to really reach consensus, and so it was eliminated immediately.
A footnote on the footnote that Greenspan was quite masterful at the first meeting. What I recall is the very first thing he asked was something very controversial. Should we allow proxies to sit in for the members of the commission? We went around the table and everyone agreed no. Now, a lot of this was probably set up in advance. He then went to the question of Medicare and Medicaid, or I forget which order, and to the question of maintaining the structure of the fundamental structure of Social Security. That decision was most important in making it possible to move a commission forward at some point. And there were the outliers, Senator Armstrong and Congressman Archer, who in today's world look fairly moderate.
Suzanne, Steve, other comments on that? None? Steve? No? Yep.
I guess the only comment I would make was what I think was really kind of special at the time we recognized was the composition of the council, which included people who really were big hitters in Congress and could make it happen if it came through. And I think it was a combination of our backs were against the wall, because remember the 77 amendments that came not long before that and fixed most, but not all, of the shortfall that we had at that time. There was still quite a bit of shortfall left at the time of the enactment of the 77 amendments, so we knew we'd be back to the table with this, and this is what happened. But the fact that, committee chairs, important people in Congress were there was really what mattered. We've, not to preempt the question that you were putting forth for later, Bill, but I think if a commission is going to be a big thing in the future, it's going to have that kind of composition. And I hate to say it, but I think that, where's Bill Hoagland? I think that a BPC commission back in 2010 had some of those people, but even more, the Simpson-Bowles Commission at that time had a lot of those people. But what it was missing at the time of 2010 was our backs were not literally against the wall.
I remember as the commission was going, as we were really having such difficulty coming to consensus, Sandy Trowbridge from the NAM stepped up as someone, sort of trying to bring the two sides together, and I guess it worked. But he played quite a role, I think, at that time.
Yeah. Also want Bruce Schobel to have a chance. Bruce, just your perspective on how fundamental restructuring was off the table. How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that I would say has been said already. It was, I guess, recognized by all the people in the room that if they went down that road, that they wouldn't get any legislation enacted ultimately, and the goal was to save Social Security, not to stick to your guns until the ship went down.
That was the ship.
Right.
I want to
right.
make sure we have
Yeah.
we have
With
a certain
P.
standard of language at the academy that is not to be
Right,
violated
right,
by
right.
anyone. Nancy, you had an additional comment?
Well, it was going to take it into a tangent in response, so I can wait. And
Okay.
hear your
Well, I want to ask one more question. I want to get the audience to have their chance to ask questions. Just to show hands, how many of you were around, maybe just the way to put it, were involved in public policy in 1982-83, where this is something you remember, just out of curiosity, quite a few of you. Okay, that's great. So I'm sure all of you have questions. We want to give you a chance. So let me ask one more question, then we'll turn over to the audience. Just give me your perspective on going from the commission's deliberations to the 83 amendments. What came out of the commission, what did not come out of the commission that made its way to the amendments? So, Nancy, you want to kick us off with that?
Yes, and it actually feeds into the comment I was going to make. And I don't think the commission was successful simply because their backs were to the wall. It really was an interesting process because, unlike Bowles Simpson and a lot of the other commissions that have come since, all the major interest groups were represented. It really was, when the people were named to this commission, most people thought there was no way they could reach agreement because you had labor and business at the table. You had seniors in the form of Claude Pepper, who was seen as Mr. Social Security. He wasn't going to let anything. You had very conservative members. You had, as you say, the various members of the chairman and ranking of the Ways and Means and Finance and so forth. It basically was as if you had the conference committee. You had the major representatives, and you had all the interest groups, so that it looked like it wasn't, nobody thought it was going to be able to reach consensus. But when it did, it was very powerful and really went through. And so as was alluded to, there were short-term financing, where they were unable to get, I think most of it was 9-3, and some of it might have been unanimous, but the part where they split was in the long term, whether you have a FICA rate increase or you reduce or if you increase the retirement age. And they decided that one Congress should decide. But one interesting point about how they went about selling it, because this all went through regular order, it was not fast-tracked, it went through committees with markup and so forth. They worked very hard to convince the House and Senate that if they started taking out one piece or another piece, the whole thing was going to fall apart. And Alan Greenspan and Bob Ball made a decision together, and that was they testified before the Finance Committee and Ways and Means, and every Republican question was answered by Alan, and every Democratic question was answered by Bob, to say, hey, this is bipartisan, we're for all of them.
Suzanne, Steve, on things that the commission did not come up with that were enacted, just any perspective on that?
Away from it too long, I think.
Well, of course, there's the one kind of fairly big one that, Nancy mentioned, which was at the time we were estimating under too much numbers around it, the 1982 trustees report assumptions. We had about a 1.8% of payroll. Everybody knows about this percent of payroll shortfall thing in the long term. We had that much of a shortfall, and we were like, I think the number was 0.68 shy from what the commission came up with to sort of fix it. And as Nancy mentioned, should we raise taxes? Should we instead change the normal retirement age, full retirement age? Take your pick. And so the can was kicked down the road to the Congress. And that's where the decision made, and that was sort of a fun thing. Finally, there was a decision made to go, I guess, with the retirement age way. It was over in the House, the retirement age. And there was a guy who's, one person who was on the staff, I'm sure everybody here remembers Tim Kelly, who's a long-time Office of Legislation and Congressional Affairs, an office that was named many different things over the time, all good things. In fact, a few from our office had lunch with him and a guy named Don Hoffmeyer. I don't know if anybody remembers Don Hoffmeyer. He was over working on the House side at the time with the Ways and Means Chair. And I remember one late night call where he was saying, okay, they've decided it's going to be retirement age, and how are we going to do this? Because they want to have exactly about this 0.7% of payroll. And so we said, well, we've already calculated what happens if we raise the retirement age by 2 years, 1 month a year, and that saves too much. And we've calculated if we raise it 2 months a year, no, I'm sorry, and that saves too much. 1 month a year saves too little, 2 months a year saves too much. It's too fast, because they wanted to start it in the year 2000 for people reaching 62. So what do we do? So we said, well, what if we take it up to 66 and then wait a while? And he said, how long do we have to wait? A couple of scribbling numbers there. He said, well, if we wait like 11 years in between, then that'll about do it. So, and that's where the 11-year so-called hiatus came. And I mean, one thing that later on in time, I'm sure Nancy recalls this well, maybe others, is that Bob Ball talking about how he liked that because he was hopeful that in the meantime, between 2005 and 2017, that in fact things would get so much better we wouldn't need the second increase in retirement age. Unfortunately, sorry, but we need it, and it's already started.
Bruce, from your perspective, was that the big thing that the amendments had that the commission did not recommend, which is the age of normal retirement?
Oh yeah, that was clearly the missing element. It was very big, and the thing that people maybe forget is that while an awful lot of the 83 amendments were sort of preordained by the recommendations of the commission, this one wasn't. We really didn't have any idea how this was going to turn out. I mean, it was a very close vote in the House. It was very late at night, and we were sitting there, and I think that the retirement age won by, I don't remember, a half a dozen votes or 4 votes or something. I mean, it was a very, very close vote, and we really just had no idea how it was going to come out. It was we were all sitting there, they had our full attention, I'll put it that way.
But actually, the commission did constrain it by recommending that it be one of those 2 approaches.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just a wide open discussion.
Well, yeah, that's true. But we didn't know when they were voting which one they would choose
Right.
of the 2 options.
No, that's right.
Well, there have been on the commission, there have been consideration about the bend points in the formula too. So that was another option that was.
But they didn't recommend.
No, they didn't
In
recommend it.
truth, at least in retrospect, I guess we could look back and say that, they could have done some of each. They could have done some increase in the retirement age, some change. Yeah, but they weren't, or they were really pick one.
But two things that the commission recommended that were passed that were really pretty significant. One was the taxation of benefits and the general revenues being fed into the trust funds. And the other one was coverage of federal workers, which included members of Congress, which members of Congress got actually quite upset about. Barbara Conable wanted to know, because Heinz had been pushing that. So when Heinz testified over in the Ways and Means Committee, his only question to Heinz was, what were you thinking?
Hi, this is an interesting period too because we had pickle, pepper, and Heinz,
Yeah, the condiments.
and
We
they were
talked about
all
the
very
condiments.
significant. And pickle had a bill that would have gone through the House, a moderately conservative Democratic bill, and had it gone through the House, it would have been more, it would involve more cuts than the 83 amendments did, as I recall. That got derailed by Stockman and Stockman's proposals and the attempt to bite off a lot more in cuts than possible. 2 things, so that's something that wasn't there. The language really mattered. Larry mentioned the commission and the commission. And I remember saying to Bob when the Blair House, so commission was supposed to end on December 31st, and I think it got a dispensation for a few more days.
Or a month or something.
Or a month.
yeah.
And there's sort of a story about Bob Dole and Senator Moynihan and Senator Bowl is sort of in Social Security history of sorts. But they managed to say, we want to do something about this. And they moved into the Blair House negotiations. I remember saying to Bob Ball, you know, it's really too bad we can't get taxation of benefits into this proposal. And he said, it's too bad, it's impossible. He said, oh no. He said, just watch. Was Bob's kind of comment to me, learn, grasshopper. And I think the benefit of that one was both that you could define it as a tax cut, a good tax cut, if you were a Democrat, that income earned at some point in the life course should be taxed. And if you're a Republican, you could talk about it as a good benefit cut. So there's a certain amount of ambiguity that I think helped ease
In
agreement.
fact,
So one of the things, Heinz loved this proposal, by the way, because when he went back to the country club, his country club members were always coming up to him saying, I don't understand why we get Social Security benefits. Why don't you just take back our Social Security benefits? So he figured this was the way you take back their Social Security benefits.
What did
Well,
they say after it happened?
I'm not sure they talked to him again after that.
But this actually was, first you have to understand the moment and the climate. A couple of years before, I think it was the National Committee on Social Security, although it might have been another one, but there was just a rumor that showed up in the Washington Post, like a whisper that someone was they were thinking about proposing taxation of benefits. The Senate had a vote 98-0, a resolution, we will never tax benefits. That had happened just a few years before. And when they were meeting in Blair House, they decided they were going to do this 50-50 split of, 50% on the revenue side, 50% on the tax side, but there was a gap. And it was Bob, he talks about it actually in the book, that he realized that this proposal, which saved enough money, could be characterized as either. And so it didn't violate that 50-50. And it's still quite controversial. There are proposals in Congress now to, but they intentionally, the idea was that it was counterpart to the way private pensions are taxed, and that it would be, the threshold wouldn't be increased.
Yeah, but the one thing is that it was designed so that benefits would slide up over it over time. So
Over
that it
time,
would
that's right, that's the
So
threshold,
that it would
yeah.
get a larger portion of that.
Right.
Get Steve.
But the one other aspect on that, because in 1994, the proposal was modified, of course, as we all know, to tax not just up to half of your benefits, because what it's half after-tax contributions and half pre-tax contributions, but to do it more really like private defined benefit pensions, where you only look at the sort of nominal amount without any indexing of the, after-tax contributions, and only forgive that. And that's where the 85% came. But there have been proposals since that would save even a little bit more money, many are aware of this, to really have the taxation benefits be like private defined benefit pension plans, which would be to, for you individually, count up how much you had put in on an after-tax basis, add that up, and subtract that from your expected benefits, and then tax all the rest. And the interesting thing about that is, it is the middle income that would have the tax increases and the highest income wouldn't. So that's perhaps why we haven't gone in that direction since.
All right, so we've got about 20 minutes. I want to give the audience a chance to ask questions. What I'd like you to do is direct your question to one of the panelists. The others have the ability to respond. And then with about 5 minutes left, I'll ask all of you your answers to that two-part question. So, Caroline?
Hi, I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. I'm a physician. My late husband was Marty Slate, who ran the PBGC. I have two questions. Number one, and Nancy and I talked, so someone else needs to answer this. When you were doing, by 1982, all the baby boomers were born. You knew that we were there. When you set the tax rate, or you made whatever adjustments you made, were you assuming that we baby boomers would be pre-funding our Social Security payments? You had big Social Security surpluses for many years, and was that in the intended use? So that's one question. The second question is, what assumptions did you make about the economy? Because the economy, It did well in the 80s. It did very well in the 90s, and then it slowed. And of course, there was the big dip, and that changes the wages that are coming in, which changes the amount of revenue that's coming in. And did you factor that in?
Thank you. Who wants to take that one, Steve?
Well, first of all, the mea culpa from the point of view of the Office of the Actuary. Back in 1982, 83, we didn't have all of the amazing people we have in our office now, and we also didn't have the computer power. So we were not able overnight or within a day to sort of run the projections in great detail. So while we were able to sort of advise the commission about what the long-term implications would be for the 75-year period as a whole for many of these, we couldn't tell precisely what the trajectory of the trust fund going up and going down would be. We weren't in a position to do that. Now, by the time we got to the Hill, for the conference committee, we were in a position to do that. One of my favorite little remembrances on this is a guy named Irv Heitner. I'm sure many recall here. I remember at one point going to Irv and saying, Irv, we have an issue here. You know, we're making it for the 75 years under our current projections, but the trust funds are going up and then they're kind of dropping like a rock at the end. Can we do something about that? Can we make some change about the timing of the tax rate increases? And his answer was basically, are you kidding? We'll lose the whole deal if we try to make a change now. So we you know, kind of like didn't go there.
And that's a name that doesn't get mentioned much. He actually was one of the founding board members of the Academy, and we tried to find him, and we couldn't. I don't know if you have any idea where he is, but he's one of those figures in history you don't hear too much about. So, Joe?
Thank you. This is for Steve or for anyone. So one of the big things that saved the day was moving the retirement age out from the normal retirement age from 65 to 66 to 67. But of course, waiting longer for the same amount is identical to getting less at any particular age. This could have been described, and I think never was, as an across-the-board benefit cut. And it was always described as a delay in the normal retirement age. And of course, we're all living longer. What the heck, waiting a couple of years for the same amount seems reasonable. My guess is lots of surveys would have said, good idea. Whereas if you'd asked the same surveyors, how about an across-the-board benefit cut? They probably would have hated the idea, even though they were identical. So was that sort of the politics of that or the PR of that ever discussed? Let's never describe this as an across-the-board benefit cut, even though it really is.
I think it's which side you were on the issue, because I think people who were on the other side of the issue were very quick to describe it as a benefit cut. And particularly for people who needed to take early retirement or didn't really have, I mean, if they've been working for a long time in, you know, heavily physically intense industries and stuff, and they were on disability already. You know, the other thing that doesn't get talked about in this is it's a shift to the disability insurance program. So, but yeah, no, I think all of those were factored in the discussion.
Yeah, Def.
Well, I think one point that I would make, this is Bruce, is that, you know, the actuaries, of course, realize that it's mathematically equivalent to a benefit cut. And one of the questions that we asked the Office of the Actuary, and Steve can comment on this, is how many people do you think are going to really change their behavior? How many people are going to just retire at the same age they would have anyway and get a smaller benefit versus actually working longer to get the same benefit? And the answer that I recall at the time, and Steve may remember better, was that they estimated 98% or 97% of the people would not change their behavior. They would just get a smaller benefit. And so we really regarded it as just a benefit cut for all practical purposes.
Well, at the time, we actually developed a little model back there prior to the 83 amendments, some vestiges of which are still hanging around, much to the chagrin of, I think, some of the folks in our office, but we're working on, you know, constantly working on our models. But as I recall right, what I think we were assuming is that for every year that we would increase the normal or full retirement age, we would expect the age to which people would work and maybe actually file for benefits would increase by about 1/3 of 1 year. And some of the work that has been done after the fact seems to have indicated that that was perhaps, you know, possibly a good guess. One of the other things, just to mention, Carol, that you mentioned earlier, what were some of the assumptions at the time? Because remember, we were estimating that the trust funds would be like okay till about 2056 at the time. It turns out right now we're not projecting reserve depletion as late as 2056. It's about 20 years earlier than that. And one of the big assumptions was at the time, the assumption of the trustees was that the wage growth, the average wage growth, would grow by about 1.5% faster per year on average than prices, and it turned out between then and now, not so much. We didn't have as much. Also, disability growth was a little faster than we had been projecting. Not that it has been really all that large. One of the things interesting about disability is that we hadn't recognized that back in, 1956, when the disability was brought into the program, for some years until like maybe the mid-1960s, people were not able to file for benefits until they reached, I think it was, age 50? So,
Right.
So it wasn't until about 2010 that we reached the point where people in their 60s had their full lifetime opportunity to file for disability benefits under the Social Security program while they were still insured. So we should not expect to have reached the full sort of what we call prevalence of disability at all ages, at the highest ages, until we were about 2010. And it looks like we're pretty much leveling off now, so it looks like those prophecies came through.
So, on the question you asked, Joe, the Democratic members, the 5 Democrats, there were more than, but it was Bob Ball, Keyes, Kirkland, and the like, Moynihan. What? Claude Pepper, yeah, can't forget that. They were very aware that it was a benefit cut. I think it was harder to sell that argument because of the other side that you expressed very well, we're all living longer, et cetera. So, and one of the arguments that was used that was effective, and I believe was true, is that there are workers, particularly lower wage workers, workers in arduous work, who will be disproportionately harmed by that. Congress decided, well, we don't know, but let's have a study. And there was a study that was done through SSA. I don't know if Malcolm Morrison did it, but study was done to basically look at the impact of raising the retirement age and to identify what percentage of workers might be hurt. They did the study. My recollection is they said 31% of workers who see their age go up on that will be hurt. And of course, they did nothing about it. But it was a clear, is that about right, Steve, your recollection? Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Mark Miller, I cover retirement for Reuters, and I'll direct my question to Nancy. And it also deals with the higher full retirement age. So thinking about that in retrospect to where we are today, the benefit cut, good policy, bad policy, or just necessary given the crisis? And if just necessary because of the crisis, if that's your response, what is the lesson of that for the next time around?
Now, this was, as is clear, the commission did not come to a resolution on that issue. And part of what the dynamic was, it was tremendous focus on the short term because they were projecting trust fund depletion and benefits not being able to be paid in full and on time within something like 18 months or something. It was coming up quite quickly. And what a lot of progressives thought was, okay, this isn't going to come into effect until 2000. It's 1983. We'll have plenty of time to revisit this and change it. Now, the politics didn't go with that. No, I think it's terrible policy. It's an across-the-board benefit cut of benefits that are already too low. Excuse me?
So the answer, you're saying they didn't think it was really going to happen.
Yeah. Well, those who voted for it wanted it to happen, but those who opposed it didn't vote down the whole package because they wanted the short term and they figured they could come back and revisit that.
Let's try to get in a couple more questions. So Larry,
Yeah,
if you wanna
I just wanted on this point, because I think the other thing the commission didn't process at the time was that the demographics were going to lead to a situation where the trust funds would be kind of over a period of time chronically, out of whack. So even though they did we disagree with this. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. So I'll give you a chance for your alternative facts. Just a second here. All right. So the point being that every year after the 83 amendments were passed, you picked up a bad demographic year, right? And you gave up a good demographic year. So the surplus years were going away, and the bad demographics were getting picked up. So inevitably, the 75-year average was going to erode over time. And it was, I think, clear to some people that this was a temporary fix. It was not a permanent fix.
Okay, we want to give audience us.
But just a real quick point, because remember at the time the amendments were actually enacted, we had at that point, shown that the trust fund reserve ratio was going to rise and would be dropping like a rock purely because of demographics. I think somebody, maybe it was Joe, mentioned earlier, didn't we already know by 1982 that the birth rate had dropped post the baby boom period, 1946 to 65, so that by 1982 it was down, I think, below 2.0 total fertility rate, and it's basically stayed at about that level since. So it was well understood at that point that adjustments would be made. I think at the time of the commission, everybody understood that people were kind of living somewhat longer, and perhaps some rise in the retirement age would be part of the solution. But I would just harken back, everybody should take a look at what, again, the Simpson-Bowles Commission did, because they came up with a very interesting, a lot of people are talking about more increase in the retirement age, like it or not, but because of the disparity and improvement in mortality for people with different earnings levels, Simpson-Bowles Commission came up with an idea saying, how about people with long careers but low earnings levels, maybe they shouldn't have the full or any of the increase. And they actually had a very interesting hybrid proposal for increase in the retirement age, which would save people with long careers, low earnings levels.
Okay, we have time for a couple more quick questions from the audience.
Thank you. I'm Tim Lyer. I'm a brand new member, and I'm thrilled to be a part of this group. And I want to present a question. I'm going to actually direct it to Nancy Altman, who I've had a chance to talk to on the phone briefly previously. But ultimately, one of the things I reflect on is that we look back to 1983, and we had, I'm not going to say easy opportunities for solutions, but we could get some current income. We could find a way to solve the problem immediately. We're now looking out to 2033, 2034, and we've got a Social Security problem we got to fix. We don't have as many opportunities that we did back then. Do you see anything easy, the low-hanging fruit, if you want to call it that, we can do to make this happen politically?
Well, this is sort of preempting what we're talking about tomorrow, because Henry Aaron's going to be presenting a proposal and I'll be responding to it. So I don't want to step on my lines too much, but I think that I take some exception with your premise, and I'm wondering if others feel the same way, and that is that, and Bruce really alluded to this, everyone understood, people understood that the 1990s were going to be a low cost period, but it was getting through the 1980s that was really the tricky part. And so, and we just basically skated through. I mean, that's why they wanted to use these very pessimistic assumptions and so forth. So, yeah, I know you go ahead if you get
Finish it.
So it wasn't so easy back then or so difficult now. I just don't think I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or understanding your question, but I think that the premise isn't quite right. And I think, once again, I'm quite confident that, that the program will continue and beyond 2034, and Congress will eventually act.
Yeah, and let me add to that. This is Bruce. It is true, and I've said this many times myself in a lot of different places, that a lot of the things that were done in 1983 can't be done again. They've already been done, and you can't do them twice. I mean, like, covering federal employees. Well, federal employees are covered now. You can't cover them another time. So obviously there are some branches on the decision tree that have been, cut away in a sense. But if you want to raise money in the short term, the obvious thing to do is raise the payroll tax, which has been at the same level since 1990. That's a really long time. The payroll tax went up, 20 times in the early years of the program. And since 1990, it's been constant. Well, that number didn't come down on stone tablets from the mountaintop. You can change it.
So let me just, a quick response, which is the difference between then and today is there really was a crisis in 1982. Come 1983, if Congress didn't act, members of Congress would have had to say, sorry, constituents, but we have to cut your benefits a bit. And you wouldn't want to be in Congress at that point. So they had to act. We don't have any action-forcing issue right now. The other thing is we have had massive growth of income inequality and wealth inequality since then. which affects the trust funds too. So we're in a very different situation, and we also have a large number of people who are moving into their retirement years who don't have much protection other than Social Security. So it's different.
Yeah, this is a, I've just had 2 glasses of red wine question. Because if I had 3 glasses, I would be smart enough not to ask it. So I've been reading this book about the Federal Reserve and its history, and it seems that in times of really big federal debt, like after World War II, they come into play in fiscal policy. So is there a tool that we're not thinking about? In other words, if we let this go till the last minute, in the Trump Commission 10 years from now, or whatever, this great president we had is going to come at this at the last minute. It's not just lowering benefits, increasing taxes, or the retirement age. Is there some kind of role for intergenerational lending? Or, right now the Fed has excess assets they don't know what to do with. I mean, is there something there that could happen to help alleviate this problem?
Well, it's interesting. A couple of things. One is that, immigration's great for Social Security. It really is. More immigration, open those doors.
And cutting immigration's bad.
Yeah.
It's going to make the
So,
shortfall
yep.
bigger.
And, but I think that, the other thing is that, what was I going to say? I know.
You had some wine, too.
No, it's what happens when you get old.
Okay, so let's do
go
this
ahead.
then. While you're starting to think of the
Oh, I
two-part
know.
question.
Can I answer the second part of what I was going to say?
You want to answer?
No, I was just
Oh,
gonna-
sure, no,
One
please.
more thing.
Yeah.
No, we only tax payroll. That's insane. I mean, payroll is such a small part now of where all of the return on investment is in the economy, where all of the return on growth is in the economy. And we're taxing the very people who are left behind, kind of earning wages when everybody else is earning a lot of other stuff.
Bruce, did you have a comment? No?
No, I already made it. I don't have more on that.
Steve?
Yeah, one item on the potential quick fixes, if you're looking on the revenue side, we still have 4% of the employees in the economy, state and local workers, who are the 1/4 of the state and local workers non-covered. They could be. Of course, there are issues in all of those states with the funding of their pension plans. There's also an issue. There's a considerable chunk of the workers in our economy that are not wage and salary workers. They're called independent contractors, self-employed. And Bureau of Economic Analysis, Department of Commerce tells us somewhere between 1/2 and 2/3 of them aren't reporting their income or aren't reporting all of it. So now, I mean, we'd need some magic, and I don't know if Alan Cohen's here tonight. We've talked before about how would we get those people to report all their income. But if they did, that'd be a lot more tax revenue coming in. That'd be possible. And of course, the taxable maximum is only $128,400 for this year.
One
So,
of our new
could be higher.
One of our new members is an economist, and she said the single biggest thing that could solve Social Security going forward is adopting the president's economic assumption of 4%. So
That would help.
therein,
That would help.
therein lies a solution. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to weigh in on the two-part question. Then we'll do a straw poll, not binding, not reportable, Mark, I gather, unless, you really think this could make news. So let me ask each of them. We'll start with Suzanne. Two-part question. Question one, should there be another Greenspan-like commission to deal with Social Security? And if your answer is yes, part two is, should it be sooner, within 5 years, or later?
Well, all I can say is that the commission in 82, 83, it was very intense. It was a very intense year among the staff, lots of dissension. It was a year that I totally enjoyed, but would not want to repeat. And as far as the new Greenspan Commission, if they get the right membership, sure. Could be.
Steve, we're going to go around. Steve?
I would suggest back at the Simpson-Bowles Commission, we were close to similar representation. What the missing part was the back against the wall about the immediacy. That would be my view. I mean, will this be the mechanism by which we come to the next big change for Social Security? Perhaps, for a lot of the reasons mentioned here. Is the timing now right for doing it? I know our office, we're ready. Bring on the commission. We're ready to work with them any day, every way.
Bruce Schobel, how do you weigh in on this?
Well, I think as was said earlier, if you had the right membership, a commission would be very useful. If you had the wrong membership, then they would just be wasting their time. Obviously, we have a lot more divergence of opinion now than we did back in the 80s. I think that there are more people in the Congress now who are willing to let Social Security go broke, whereas in 1980, if anybody had said that, they would have been looked at with horror, like, what are you talking about? But I think that they really should start working on this sooner rather than later, for the simple reason that as we get closer and closer to the trust fund exhaustion date, a lot of options disappear. If you want to protect the people who are currently on the benefit rolls, then really benefit cuts take place so far in the future that they're not effective as a financial matter. And the only thing you can really do is raise taxes, which I think would be, it would be hard for people to do that. I think one of the other points to make, though, I mean, sometimes when I talk about raising taxes, which I think has to be part of any bipartisan solution, people say, oh, the Congress would never do that. And my answer is, I'm not talking about the Congress in the year 2018. I'm talking about the Congress in the year 2030. And who knows what they would do? We don't, we haven't met some of those people yet.
That's a good point, Bruce. My answer is no, I don't think we should have another commission. And the reason is that in bringing a commission together, we will implicitly be saying we want to have a balance between cuts and revenue increases. I think cuts are a mistake today. 1982 is different from 2018, not just in terms of presidents, but in terms of the economic security of working people. We've seen people's pensions move from defined benefits into defined contributions. There's less security there. We know that we're looking at a large number of people moving into retirement with very limited income. So I don't think we should be talking about cutting the Social Security benefit at all. I certainly would take the position that we're not a poor country. We feel it, but we're not. There are a variety of ways we could increase revenue and address these concerns and also expand the system. So I go to that. I take that. And Steve and I had a little difference in 1982 over our retirement age, and maybe a little difference here. I don't think a Bowles-Simpson commission would be helpful at all. In fact, I would see it through my lens, not Steve's, with deep respect for Steve. I see it as a very conservative commission that was dead set on cutting benefits and making Social Security cuttable, among other things. So we have a different view, but I always respect Steve.
But it did not even have a majority of the members voting for its outcome.
Yeah.
Simple majority.
So I would, I think no, and I think there's a simple reason for that. The 82 commission was an incredibly fact-rich exercise. I mean, sitting and spending 3 or 4 hours with Bob Myers, reading through very detailed information about the Social Security system. We all got an incredible education. I think it's, we're in a very different environment. I think the first thing is, it was a committee where they took the leading influencers politically and put them in the room, both in the Congress and in the private sector, the leaders of industry and labor, and I don't know who you would pick today as leading influencers. I was thinking about this, and I was wondering whether you would get like celebrities, basketball players. I'm not sure.
She's not running.
Tom Brady. What? Anyway, so I mean, I think the issue around credibility, around people's willing to trust the experts, around people's ability to agree on what is a fact. I mean, we're in a very different environment, and so when you say, well, let's take a nice commission full of all the right people and put them in the room and have a very intellectual, kind of very rich exercise in trying to work through what's the right answer to the problem, seems very 20th century to me.
And I say, absolutely not. the commission is a way of our elected officials avoiding accountability. And in fact, I am happy to say that if you read Bob Ball's book, the reason that book came out of, as he was dying, he wrote his memoirs, and but he asked Tom Bethel, his longtime co-writer, to pull out that chapter and publish it independently, because he was afraid that people today would say, oh, let's do the Greenspan Commission, and he thought it was a terrible idea. He wrote a op-ed about a few months before he died, said it's the height of responsibility to have no cuts, for the reason that Eric was saying. It seems to me the American people are quite united. Poll after poll after poll shows that they want no cuts. They'd like to see the program expanded. And of course, solvency is simply a means to an end. I am quite confident that if, I'm again giving away my punchline for tomorrow, but basically the bottom line is Congress, it should deal with this. It should go through regular order. And if Democrats run on expansion and get elected, they can start that process.
Bruce Schobel, you have the next to last word. Bruce?
Well, I already answered the question. I think that whether you have a commission or not, you ought to move sooner rather than later, so that you have options available to you that are going to disappear at the last minute.
Okay. So now at the moment of truth for the audience. Again, two-part question. How many of you think we should have a Greenspan-like commission to deal with Social Security's long-term financing? Just a show of hands. Should. Okay, very small number, very, very small number. So this is easy. Those of you who have your hands up, how many think it should be sooner? 1, 2, 3, 3 people. And how many think it should be later? Two people. This is amazing. Well, well, that would keep us here beyond the curfew, maybe and after this conversation. Now, whenever we have an Academy event, I can't tell you how many people ask, what would Bob Ball think and what would Bob Ball say? Now, we don't have him here other than spirit, but let me read how he concluded his book. To suggest that the Greenspan Commission provides a model for resolving questions about Social Security's future would be laughable if it were not so dangerous. Democrats in Congress who believe in strengthening rather than undermining Social Security should be willing to stand up for what they believe. Preferably, and he wrote this in 2000? 2008. Preferably with a strong supporter of Social Security in the White House. But stand up in any case. A commission is no substitute for principled commitment. Above all, we should not allow ourselves to fall into the trap of expecting miracles from another Greenspan Commission by deluding ourselves into believing mistakenly that the first one was a great success. So I think you all either read the book before on your vote, but it's clear what the view prevails. I do want to acknowledge 2 other board members who joined us. Renee Landers, our vice chair in the back. Renee, just raise your hand. And Rebecca Vallis, I think I saw Rebecca. She went out, okay. If we were to have a Greenspan Commission, I think it's these people right here. So let me thank the panel, Eric, Larry, Nancy, Suzanne, Steve, and Bruce.
Thank you.
And Bruce, thank you for being in Denver and interrupting your schedule to do this. I hope you found this insightful, educational, and valuable. I hope you'll all join us tomorrow for a whole day of what I think will be very stimulating, provocative discussion, not the least of which will be Henry Aaron, who is here, and Henry will be presenting his long-term proposal for Social Security. So thank you again. We'll see you all tomorrow. Good night.